thank you all for joining us. I'm Teresa Snow. I'm the founder and executive director of Salvation Farms. We're a nonprofit our mission is to build increased resilience in Vermont's food system through agricultural surplus management. So a lot of things in this day resonate with me as founder about how you approach things with a mind for resilience. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how the session is going to go today. We're all going to introduce ourselves. And then each of our panelists will give a presentation about the work that they've done regarding food loss on farms and what they see are our opportunities to build resilience in the food system by looking at this opportunity that is food loss on farms. And as we look here in Vermont to build a more independent food system, one that relies on its producers, it seems like focusing on food produced that is edible, that's not making it to people, is a great way to look at where our supply chain breaks down and what supports mechanisms, responses should be developed so that we're more secure and independent as a food system and as a people. So I think that also frames why Salvation Farms is facilitating this dialogue. In Vermont, it hasn't been really recognized as an opportunity, the food that's remaining on farms, not just the produce, but also the proteins. And we're going to discuss just today really the produce that remains on farms. But we need to, in this dialogue around food system development and resilience and preparation for, and response to climate change, how do we become wiser about using this food and using it as a tool to create that systemic change that we're looking to do?
So as Teresa said, my name is Prescott, and I'm a program officer at the World Wildlife Fund. So our team is about 4 years old, and right around the same time, Teresa's report came out on vegetable and berry loss. And, it's very important that we are all talking to each other and that we're not replicating each other's efforts. And so we right away brought Teresa onto our advisory committee to kind of oversee the work that we did looking at the specialty crops that I'll be discussing in the presentation. So just for those who don't know that iconic panda, I do just want to mention our mission, which is that we're a global science-based organization, and we work with both companies and communities to meet the needs of both people and nature. And I'll, touch very briefly on what some of those large companies are that we're working with to meet our conservation mission. Next slide, please. So why food waste? So I mentioned that we're concerned with the implications of agricultural expansion. This number, 70% of biodiversity loss caused by food production, is very startling. And as Laura mentioned earlier, we're all aware of what's happening with water use and soil erosion. So it's about 70% of water use is going into food production, and that's about 30% of greenhouse gas emissions, and 30% of soil erosion is all due to food production. So we got interested in understanding how much food is not being utilized. How can we prevent the unnecessary spread of agricultural lands? So like I said, our team is pretty new. It's just 4 years that we got started. And at that time, Reef Add, which is a nonprofit made up of many different stakeholders, put out their roadmap to reduce food waste by 20%. And they identified 4 hotspots for food loss and waste on the supply chain. But the 3 biggest ones were consumers, consumer-facing businesses, and farms. But we looked at this report and saw a lot of gaps in that data. So for example, the number at the 16% of food waste happening at the production level was only drawn from some old USDA reports and then a small sample of growers in Minnesota. And then again, going back to not wanting to replicate other people's efforts, when we were developing our strategy, we didn't want to work on consumer level food waste because there were a lot of people already working in that space. Natural Resource Defense Council was one of the main ones leading the way with that. So if you go to the next slide, we developed these 5 strategies, and I'm going to primarily be talking about production and farms because that's what I've been working on over the past few years. But I do just like to mention all of these, and if you guys have any questions about our other work streams, I'm happy to answer that after the panel. But hospitality, restaurants, retail, farms, and schools and universities. And we have 3 public-facing documents. One of them is being passed around you guys right now. The one that I'll be talking about, our farm report. But we did also put out a hospitality toolkit for hotels that basically helps them with reducing food loss and waste through their whole operations, called Hotel Kitchen. And then we also put out a curriculum for teachers called Be a Food Waste Warrior, and that's just to teach kids about how to reduce food loss and waste at home and at school. And we've had success. Hilton's been adopting the Hotel Kitchen toolkit, and then we're seeing the school curriculum spread. And I don't have statistics on that, but we just put that out about a year ago. So, our report, No Food Left Behind. So there's both a short version and a more technical version going around. But we just put out this report a couple months ago. And we started this work about 2 years ago, and we decided to focus on 4 crops. And that was peaches, tomatoes, processing potatoes, and leafy greens. And we did choose all of those crops for a reason. Romaine is the highest value per unit of production crop that we grow in the US. Potatoes have the highest sales right now. And then tomato, we wanted to do a stone fruit, so we chose peaches, and a vine crop, so tomatoes. And they're both very, highly perishable. So we felt like that was a good sample to start with. And how we did this research, we worked with research partners at UC Davis and Global Cold Chain Alliance. And we wanted to make sure that they were doing different methodologies for collecting data just to reduce any bias. So UC Davis did a more qualitative approach and did primarily grower interviews in California. And then Global Cold Chain Alliance, which is a trade organization, they did in-field data collection, which also came with grower interviews because it's really important to gain the trust of those farmers before they let you go on farm and just, stomp around their fields and stake out sample measurement plots. And, you really need to gain that grower network. So if you go to the next slide. So I'm going to just do a pretty high-level overview of the results that we found, and then hopefully, you guys will have more questions about it, and we'll talk about it on the panel. But we looked at romaine in Arizona, and this was actually the last crop we did in just 2018, so this is very recent. And this is what we found, 56% loss in field. But I like to show this picture because this is after the harvest, and it looks like a full field of romaine. But one of the things we have to think about when we talk about collecting data and measurement and going back to the farmers and working on solutions is, do we even have the same definitions of what edible versus inedible is? So if you just click, there we go. These are some of the quotes, direct quotes that we got from growers that I really like to show because, if I was to have just showed you this number, 56% loss in field, you might think, what's wrong with these growers? Why are they wasting all that? Like, this is not a grower problem. This is coming from much higher up the chain. And, it's the fact that these outer leaves that you're looking at, that's what is left in field, isn't marketable. And, a grower might look at this field and say, that's not loss. Like, that was the workhorse of the plant. That's what was needed to produce the romaine heart and the romaine heads that were the marketable product that I harvested. So when we talk about loss and waste and edible and inedible product, are we using standard definitions? Does everyone along the supply chain agree on those definitions? So these are questions we need to think about when we do this research. So tomatoes, and I should mention that romaine is picked and packed in field, so we didn't have measurements for pack house loss. But tomatoes and peaches, if you want to go ahead to the next one actually, they both have similar numbers. So 39 to 40% loss in field and about 14-15% loss in the packing house. Also, something interesting is that the loss in field is what we measured, but the loss in packing house was still based off of farmer estimates. So we didn't actually measure anything. We just asked the growers how much they thought was being lost. And so other reasons for loss besides market dynamics, like what I mentioned with the romaine, or when the crop is maybe overripe. So this was taken, these were peaches that were, too ripe for the transport journey. So, instead of maybe being able to find a local market, that just wasn't in the cards. They just left it in the field. They don't have the labor. So we're seeing market dynamics, product being too ripe for transport, quality standards. You can go to the next slide. Quality standards and labor shortages and labor costs are the main reasons for loss that we're focusing on. So this was the loss crop we looked at, potatoes, and we did this in Idaho. And as you can see, it's very different than the other crops. So only 2.5% loss in field and about 2% in packing house. So one of the reasons that could be is because most of the potatoes in our country are for the processing market, about 60%. So as you can imagine with that, the quality standards are a lot more relaxed. Also, something interesting that we found with potatoes is that the system for production was very vertically integrated. So the buyers, essentially had control of their whole supply chain all the way down to the grower. So they were even, telling the grower how to grow their crop, how much to grow, providing them with their soil amendments, their fertilizers. They had control of their trucking operations, their processing facilities. So whether, that might create more transparency in the system, that they can be more aware of their economic opportunities to prevent that loss and utilize it, or it's just the quality standards and the fact that it's all going for processing. It's just important to note the difference between the crops. The last part of this report that we did is called a Lifecycle Assessment. So we wanted to look at the resource use implications, especially as a conservation organization, for growing those crops and for the crops that don't make it out of the field. So the nitty-gritty details are in those reports, but the one example I could give is that the amount of tomatoes that never make it off the field, past the farm gate, the water that was used for growing those is equal to about the household use of, or the water use of 38,000 households per year. So that's a lot. That's all the point. That's a lot of use of a precious resource that we have shortages right now of, that essentially never even made it off the field. But as you'll notice from these quotes, what we need to think about is, okay, if you were to harvest that tomato that was a little pink on the shoulders, so like a little bit too ripe, but then it was just wasted somewhere further down the supply chain in transportation, you used more resources and again wasted them just to get lost somewhere else. So then we need to ask ourselves, is the best place for loss actually in the field? Of course, food banks and people working with food insecure populations don't want to hear that. But that's, that is going to help us in figuring out exactly these solutions that we need to, pilot and test in terms of, bringing these solutions straight to the field and what that would look like. So I like these quotes. They're pretty powerful. So this, as I mentioned, in working with Teresa and Lisa, in the work that we've done and what I've gotten a sense of from being here today and in all these different conferences I go to, which has been really great, is just how open everybody is with their data. So we, in doing this work, have just come across a lot of other research organizations, nonprofits, state level governments, also collecting data. And it's been really great to see a lot of people working in this space, but also that our numbers have been similar. So that's very reassuring. And I just want to throw Santa Clara out there as an example because they've been doing extensive work in the Salinas Valley in California, which is the salad bowl of our country. So they've been doing a lot of great work. They're continuing to do great work, and we're getting similar results as they are. So that is the report and everything we've been doing in the past couple of years, and I look forward to everyone's questions. These last two slides, it's kind of just to get everyone thinking about possible solutions, where we should be headed next. Really, I just want to hear everyone's feedback and your thoughts on this, but something we're starting to unpack and look into a bit is what it would look like if we could improve forecasting. So in other words, if we could know how much produce was going to be ready at harvest time, like 2-3 weeks earlier, so that we could best direct it, through the correct alternative, channel. Would that essentially lead to less loss? So, if you know 3 weeks early that you're going to have an excess of some of your tomato field and you don't need it because the contract that you were going to be growing for only asked for X amount, then with that amount of time, could you find somebody to come glean your field, or send it to a regional market before it's too ripe? Because right now it's they don't know that until it's ready at harvest, and that's why it's being left behind, is because it's too late. So we're starting to unpack a bit of that, and I hope to get some feedback on that from you guys. And then the last slide, again, we're not doing any work in this area right now. This is more of just a food for thought slide I like to throw in, which is bringing frozen back again, making frozen sexy again, and like how much that could really shift market supply, consumer behavior back to eating seasonally. So, the demand for fresh produce has been going up while the demand for frozen and canned has been going down. And it's great. It's because people are, more concerned with their health. But for some reason, it's making frozen and canned food look bad. And, they're not necessarily bad products. They're just not fresh and look as beautiful in the grocery store. So what would it look like if we, could kind of make frozen the new hot products? Like, how would that really shift everything? So yes, I hope to talk about that more later, and that is all I have. So thank you.
Hi, Lisa Johnson, North Carolina State University. I first got interested in food loss and waste back in 2009, 2010. I started reading a couple of really rather sensational books on the topic. I read Wasted by Tristram Stewart, and then American Wasteland by Jonathan Bloom, neither one of which really dived deep enough into produce crops for me. And so I started digging into how much food is left unharvested on farms and couldn't find the numbers I was interested in. So I called all around the country to see who was working on this, talked to charitable organizations, universities, government bodies, and they all told me nobody's working on this. And so I said, great, I'll work on it. And this is where it's got me. But now I'm starting to dip into, maybe scratch the surface of the numbers I really wanted. And so that's, a little of what I'll be talking about today. Today I wanted to bring to you some perspectives from maybe mid to large scale vegetable production in North Carolina, which is what we have a lot of. We also have a lot of smaller scale sustainable production. We have that too. That's not the direction my work has taken though. And I have been doing a lot of work on estimates in the field, and so we're going to talk about that too. Okay. So the number I feel that really hits the media a lot is 40%. We do not consume 40% of our food. I just wanted to point out that if you dig a little deeper into these numbers, which we all should be doing, right, you would find that 40% really does not include the agricultural level, because it's on you. It's just a calculation, and it's based in kilocalories, subtracting what we consume, our average consumption from our food supply, which includes imports. I know y'all are wondering. Yes, it does. But what it doesn't include is the food that doesn't reach the food supply in the first place, right? So it's left on the farm. So this 40% number is, in my opinion, low. Scary, right? Okay, let's move on. If you drill down a little deeper into fruit and vegetable crops, because that's what I'm interested in, and if you get further down, one more time, into just North America and Oceania, I hope that's how you say that, you can see that we do have some more detail estimated in the fruit and vegetable supply chain. One more time. The bottom part of that bar represents the estimated losses in agriculture of our fruit and vegetable supply. And that is estimated at 20%, which, with no further information, and this is on like a continent level, right? With no further information, we can guess that to mean about 10% in the field and about 10% in packing. There's many problems with this 10% or this 20% number, but I'm going to point out another one. This number was actually an assumption, if you go back in the literature, made by a plant pathologist in the 1960s who did not share his method in coming up with the 20%. And that 20% has been carried forward in every report on post-harvest loss since that time. Just saying, time to investigate these kind of things. What has changed in agriculture since the 1960s? Only the cultivars we use, our spacing, irrigation technology, some of our appearance quality standards, our fertility packages, pest and disease resistance, everything, right? Since the 60s. Okay. So I live in North Carolina, and I know it's a lot different than Vermont, so just want to give you an overview. Agriculture is our most important industry, and it's in the $85 billion range for us and employs around 700,000 people right now. We have nearly 150,000 acres in vegetables, melons, and sweet potatoes. Sweet potato is our most important crop at around 90,000 acres. It's all hand harvested, almost all. So when this 40% came out in the media, people started asking immediately, we have all this waste, we have hungry people, why are we not coming together with these two things? I felt the same way, so I wanted to know, one more time, how much surplus do we have in the state of North Carolina? Our rate of food insecurity is actually a little bit higher than the national average. We're in a little bit worse shape down there. So I wanted to know how much agricultural surplus we have, because isn't that what we're supposed to be eating, right? Okay, let's see. So my work is kind of rooted in what is left in the field when the grower ends the harvest. For me, for every field I've ever been in, if it's bell pepper or cabbage or squash or whatever, arugula to zucchini, you like to look at, it's you, it falls into these three categories. The first category is marketable quality that the grower would be able to sell but is for some reason not able to get after in his or her own field. I hope that makes sense. And then the edible category, there's a portion of the crop that's left behind that's fresh, healthy, at the correct maturity, undamaged, nutrient dense, ready to eat, but is not accepted by the marketplace for whatever reason. Then there's a third category that's inedible, and you could consider this to be what's damaged or diseased, broken, or overmature. And in our American culture, let's say, not suitable for human consumption. In North Carolina, I have investigated this quite a bit in eastern North Carolina, which is the primary production part of our state. Go ahead. Using a very straightforward and simple and fast measurement protocol. Basically taking a sample and scaling that sample up to the field, just like you would do if you wanted to measure like bacteria in a stream or something like that. Take a sample and calculate up what's there, right? It's done you can measure harvest potential at any time. If you're a farmer, you can measure at the beginning, is it time to harvest, or like at the peak of harvest, how much would I get if I went out there today? I just applied the same method to the end of the season. After the grower has said, we're no longer going to harvest this field. It's done. So all you do is you take a sample, like I said, harvest rows, sort the samples into those three broad categories, weigh and record those, and then calculate the potential in the field. Very easy. Okay, go ahead. So what happens when you do that over and over again is you come up with some averages, and these are just averages. I took out all the statistics for y'all, so we're just looking at the important numbers here. If you think about, there you go. If you think about just that marketable quality that grower could sell today if there was a market for it or if the price was right, etc. There was this much pounds per acre of all of these on average that I found. So when you do that over and over again, these are the 8 crops I looked at in North Carolina. You can see a couple of pretty nice opportunities emerge, regionally speaking. In North Carolina, we have a pretty decent opportunity for processing bell peppers. There's a company that will take them kind of on as you have them and make pickled peppers out of them, so that's great. Sweet potato, our largest crop, there's a lot of opportunity there to make dehydrated potatoes. They're made into juice, they go into pet food, et cetera, et cetera. There's all these opportunities for that. If you click one more time, move into the edible category. Here's where we really start to see the social impact of the food that is left behind. This is all fresh, healthy, delicious, nutritious food that just doesn't meet our standards for quality. And so hopefully you can start to see a lot of opportunities there. Cucumber really stands out to me, but then again, I've been in a lot of cucumber fields and measured a lot of cucumbers. So I don't know if y'all are fans of the same TV shows that I am, but I'm just going to put out there that I watch a lot of Gold Rush. Okay, so anyway, that's what I do. And they like to say on Gold Rush that, everybody's a millionaire. You just have to get it out of the ground first. This is that same opportunity right here. The only thing standing in the way of us getting this to people is just the harvest system we have now, right? And our distribution system, right? No big deal. Y'all are working on that right here, I know. Figure it out. Okay, next one. So when you compare these pound per acre numbers with yield numbers for North Carolina, you can get to percentages, which are a little bit more challenging, but people do like to talk about them. So when you compare what was left in the field with what was marketed, this is what you get. The 10% there representing the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations data estimating about 10% in the field. So there's where we should be, or where we were in the 60s, or where somebody thought we should be now, but we're not there. If you take a look there, the edible quality is in yellow and the marketable in green. I don't know if it's too hard to see. Go again. The snapshot type of work that I have done really suggests that our numbers need to be higher for at least North Carolina, but you could venture to say maybe the country. Let's see, 42% was the grand mean lost in the field, which kind of matches up with what Lee had mentioned in lettuce, in tomatoes, in peaches, right? These are similar crops. Okay, let's go again. So if you were to extrapolate this kind of data onto a national level, go ahead, you would see that we're not maybe wasting 50% of fruit and vegetables. Maybe we're up closer to 80 to 90. Scary, right? That's what we're supposed to be eating, is what I have been told. So we need to work on it. And so I want to point out we really need innovation in harvest and distribution, like I mentioned. Contracts is a big area that I know Lee is also interested in. Go again. This issue really looks a little bit more like food systems and market structure, which I know y'all are most interested in, rather than post-harvest technology, which we have made dramatic improvements on in the last many, many decades, which is why we're here today, which is why these bars here are so small, because we have post-harvest technology. So what I want to move into now is the solutions, which is where everybody wants to be, but we're maybe not all there yet. The national conversation is really focused on solutions and how do we get there. One more time, please. The most popular suggestion for agricultural producers to do to reduce their loss is to donate it. And there are many ways people are suggesting to improve our donation system, be it here software, policy, even infrastructure. And I wanted to find out from growers if that's going to work best for them to reduce losses. So I've done qualitative research in North Carolina with mostly, one more time, mid to large scale growers. And I don't know what mid to large scale means here, but there it would mean about 100 to 1,500 acres. So pretty large. But the growers that I have spoken to operated right around 20% of vegetable production acreage in the state. So I feel like I got a good handle on management trends for conventional, primarily vegetable producers. Go ahead. So I wanted to offer you a couple perspectives, as Lee did, on what growers have said, and it really shows you the things they're trying to balance day to day. So for example here, cucumbers have no salvageable value once you leave fresh market. So once that's over with, it's gone. It's just like cutting off a spigot. Go ahead. See, this illustrates how there's no buyer after the fresh market for cucumbers. Growers don't have that. Go ahead. So we actually take random samples out of the field, and if we start to see issues, then we're able to make a financial decision whether it's worth continuing to harvest or not. Right here, see, this is illustration of quality. Growers monitor quality all the time, and as soon as that quality starts to deteriorate as the season goes on, they're likely going to stop the harvest. Okay, one more time. If I'm not going to make enough per bushel to harvest it, I just leave it in the field. I try just to harvest the product in market. So that's an illustration of price. So they're balancing all these things, which sometimes we've read about, right? But there's even more things they're balancing, and probably more I haven't come up with. Let's see. When you have a load or two rejected, they will stop harvesting. Most times late in the season, it's because they're overripe, and the best thing you can do is just walk away from it. So this is an issue of financial risk. When a grower ships something that's maybe on that threshold of quality, and it comes back, that can be thousands and thousands of dollars out of their pocket right then. One more. There's another, you'll have another planting that'll come in behind that. We try to plant every 3 to 4 weeks so that when that crop's done, we start on a new crop. So the growers in North Carolina anyway work with a lot of different labor structures, but one is the H-2A, the federal program. And so growers have to ensure their workers are getting a certain number of hours. So if they're not needed in one field, they are probably needed in another field. But if not, then the grower is going to work really hard to improve their planning for next year to make sure they can make a smooth transition. Their workers always need to be working. Go ahead. So when I asked them about the solutions that they saw working for reducing losses in their field, this is what they told me. I gave it a hierarchy structure, just like the EPA food waste reduction hierarchy. I think that's what it's called. And if you're not familiar with this shape, it just shows the most preferable option on the top and the least preferable option on the bottom. What growers told me they wanted to see that would help them move all of their product was market consistency and high prices, more processing opportunities. We have problems with this in North Carolina. Increased produce demand. So y'all get to work on that one too. But they do care about donation. They would like to see it incentivized and facilitated a little bit better. And alternative marketing strategies. Growers are really interested in emerging markets like ugly produce or that kind of thing, but they're a little on the fence about it until they see how well it works. I did hear from several people that consumer expectations maybe need to be modified a little bit and that we've gotten a little too fussy about what we're choosing. And growers often feed animals with any unutilized crops, and they, of course, do land application. They don't prefer to do that, but they would prefer all those ones above it, but that's what they have to do. Go ahead. So I just wanted to point out that in our latest food loss and waste conversations happening, the solutions that are often promoted for growers are to reduce overproduction, which I have not seen or confirmed is not a practice anyway in the growers I've spoken with in North Carolina. Facilitating donation through different things and supporting alternative markets. So these are the most popular. But I don't know if y'all are familiar with this issue. These solutions come out of a heavy focus on reducing food waste further downstream in like restaurant, retail, and consumer level. So those strategies don't really work that well in agriculture. I mean, it's a unique situation. So we can't just sort of apply the same strategies to the production level. Go ahead. This is one of our growers in North Carolina. You can go ahead again. What we try and do, one of the things we try and do is really connect them into all these emerging markets that they may not know about. So we have lots of new startups just like y'all do, and so growers want to be connected and want to see how well it works out and if those are good customers and all of that. So they're willing to try everything once, I think. I wanted to make sure that y'all know that I have put out some guidance if you want to do measurement on your own farms or with farmers that you know. This is like a how-to guide on how to do measurement, and you can find that through North Carolina State Extension. It's a bulletin there. If you click again, I put out 2 YouTube videos on how to measure. Unfortunately, you have to put up with me, measuring stuff and then talking you through calculations. But there's 2 examples, a sweet potato and a cucumber example. Go ahead. If you're wonky and like to learn about methods, there's a journal article about that. And one more time. And then there's some more detail on losses in North Carolina if you feel like comparing to your own state or anything like that. Go ahead. Right now, I wanted to point out that I'm working currently on a project in processing vegetables, trying to understand more about what are the constraints there, what losses are growers running into with processing crops. If y'all are familiar with carrot production here in Vermont, then you'll probably recognize this carrot harvester that I ran into in the Midwest. It's called an ASA Lift. Just lifts them right up out of the ground. It's pretty amazing. So some of the objectives for this project are to determine food loss in a handful of important processing vegetable crops, determine those causes for losses, and improve awareness among growers of loss minimizing techniques. That's about all I have. I have a great team working at North Carolina State with me on this issue, and you may know some of them.
I'm just loving your accent.
You may know some of them.
I mean, I'm sorry. I'm really interested in everything.
But if y'all want to, I have a card. If anybody's interested, if y'all want to reach me, you can email me at l_johnson@ncsu.edu. I actually don't like shouting out in these situations myself. So if you want to talk later, we can. Anyway, that's all I had today. Thank you.
I'm going to present just kind of an overview of an estimate of food loss on particularly vegetable and berry loss on Vermont farms. This came out a while ago, so I'm going to go through it actually pretty quickly, but because I want us to get to kind of new research which is coming out, which is in the kind of editing feedback phase, which is where we got feedback from Vermont farmers on what they think should be done to respond to food loss. We did in-depth interviews, and I think actually the responses are so in line with your beautiful in a hierarchy that it is just perfect. So we might just have to go back to that slide a few times. So we did this Vermont food loss study. I'm sure all of you have read it. I have it on your wall and all of that. But we surveyed all vegetable, berry, and actually a number of fruit farmers as well. We got 58 responses, good representation from well around the state. And what we found, we did a whole bit of calculation, not based on in-field food loss, but based on farmer estimations. And on average, it was about, our estimate was 14.3 million pounds of just vegetables and berries, just in Vermont, are lost annually. And this is shocking because the previous estimates were around 2 million pounds. So, 13.7, most of it were vegetables, and a smaller amount, 590,000 pounds, were berries. But still, shocking. And even with included in the full report, we have all of our ranges and all of our assumptions, and we kind of take all of that into account. The bottom line is still millions and millions, like huge amounts of pounds are being lost each year. And for us, and I think it's so important that we're all in the same definition, so I really appreciate Leah's point on this. For us, food loss is edible produce that is left unpicked in the field or picked produce that is neither sold nor donated. So food that's really we could be eating, right? This varies along different reports, so for this is our definition. And so that first part, it's edible, but it's left unpicked in the field. We would probably consider those beautiful romaine. That picture is astounding. Those leaves probably edible. 32% of those 14.3 million pounds, 32% is edible produce left unpicked. And then most of it actually was picked, but then wasn't sold and then wasn't donated. So just kind of walking us through, the way we conceived of this idea of you have a certain number of acres that you harvest, then you have the pounds of produce you pick, pounds of produce you don't pick. And so let's first focus on that piece, right? So of everything that's not picked in the field, you're walking around, some of it is just inedible, right? And some part of this is partially inedible, some of it's fully inedible. And then you have the pounds of edible produce. So the average vegetable and berry farmer, it's 85% of the produce that grows is picked, which is just, let's use that as our benchmark, which means 15% of the produce that grows is left unpicked in the field. Lots of different reasons for this. This is based on actually interviews, and then we did this in the survey.
So most said, listen, some part of it's probably edible, but it's blemished in some way. We're really not confident it would be able to be sold. And then this idea of labor, affordable, available, and then other reasons. And so of this 15%, 85% picked, 15% unpicked, the average vegetable farmer in Vermont, 34%, so it's about a third of them, they said it was edible. So they would have said, this is totally good to eat. Okay, and the average berry farmer, 25% of that is good to eat. I know I'm going through this pretty quickly. You can always just raise your hand and shout out for any clarification or questions. But then what happens to this produce? This particular produce, some is captured by gleaners. How many pounds, I won't put you on the spot, but a certain number of pounds every year. I think it was at the time of the report is around 600,000 pounds.
It represents about 5% of what's available.
And then most of it actually is turned in the field or given to pasturing animals. Again, this is stuff that's left unpicked in the field. So now let's move to the stuff that produce picked. It's actually picked now, okay? Some amount is just sold, and then some amount is not sold. So let's focus on this. And we're really focused actually on the pounds of produce that not sold, then also not donated, right? So the average vegetable farmer in Vermont sells 81% of picked produce, leaving 19% unsold, right? And then the average berry farmer sells 86% of picked produce, which is, pretty high, and then leaving 14% of it unsold. Why is the food not sold? A lot of this is kind of repetition. Probably you guys know this really well, but, there's not a demand for the product. It's oversaturated. There's just every kale came in too much, or there's too many zucchinis at a certain point in the summer. The produce, while completely edible, it wasn't up to cosmetic standards of, certain type of standards. And then the produce was only partially edible, and then among other reasons. And you can look in the report that we have that's on Salvation Farms' website. It goes into much more detail about all of this. But then of the 19% of vegetables unsold, a third are donated, 2/3 are not donated. So there's a substantial percentage which moves on to the food bank, food pantries, soup kitchens, things like that. And then of the 14, and this does not constitute all of the produce that's donated, by the way, just as a side note. But then of the berries, 14% of berries unsold, 4% are donated. Most are not donated. The vast majority are not donated. So what happens when this produce isn't sold or donated? Some's eaten by farmers or their friends and families. Still, that's actually perfectly right for our definition. Some is made into value-added produce by farmers, not sold to processors who make it into value-added produce, but taking those extra strawberries that are now, after not having been sold in the market, into jam, that kind of example. And then a large percentage made into compost or fed to animals. Okay, so that was the quick speed through of a Vermont food loss study. But that kind of brings us up to, there was a lot of conversation, even in that report and then afterwards, about, what do we do? How do we capture that food loss? And I think, again, Lisa and Lee really set this up perfectly. How did you know? So we talked with, next slide, we did a qualitative study interviewing 24 farmers from around Vermont. It was actually the interviews were conducted by Middlebury College students. And we asked them a series of questions. We included fruit farmers as well. On a series of questions, really trying to understand what was feasible, what they thought was promising, what they would want to take part in, what they thought was a good idea. One thing, a quick note, important for qualitative studies, particularly this one, or including this one, is that it's not representative sample of farmers from across the state. What this really does is give us good depth. It doesn't give us good breadth of the issues. So everything that's presented here, I think that we want lots of feedback on how relevant this is kind of to a broader audience here. So the first thing that came up, which is kind of their top 2 or 3 in your hierarchy, more markets for seconds. So seconds, right, this idea of often cosmetically imperfect, maybe just that often includes misshape or just smaller size, not up to certain grades, that makes up a large part of food loss, right? And farmers are very interested in finding more markets for this. And farmers have already access to, in Vermont, on smaller, a number of farmers to some extent have accessed two types of these type of markets where they can sell this type of product. So the first is to institutions such as restaurants and schools, prisons, lots of organizations like that where they don't have such strict standards on the size of the potato, the shape of the beet, things like that. And the second is to value-added processors. So there's lots of examples of apple being sold to cider makers and berries sold to jam makers and all of the amazing products that we probably ate at lunch today too, but that type of thing. So again, this is a qualitative study, so really based on narrative. And this is just one quote from a farmer from Addison County. What farmers need is to get a decent price for our food. We don't need more systems where we're figuring out how to give away more food. This was not just an isolated quote, this was capturing a sentiment expressed by many farmers that we interviewed. So from this, all of this discussion with the farmers and kind of looking across all of them, there are a number of recommendations, right? And so the first one is, well, let's increase marketing of seconds to institutions such as restaurants and school, as well as to value-added processors, right? This is like a simple recommendation. It's not a simple thing to operationalize, right? There are obviously a whole bunch. I mean, how many panels are today, have already gone on today, will continue to go through the rest of this conference of, well, how do you expand that? How do you actually get this to happen? It's not super simple, but this is definitely where there is so much interest among farmers as to, we really see an opportunity where we can use all of this produce, the marketable that's not being sold, to steal Lisa's terminology, the edible and the edible that's not being sold right now. Another theme that really came up a lot in these interviews which is a subpoint of the first one, is that there's a lot of concern over the prices of the seconds impacting the price of the first. Because the point is to make a profit. Or one big point, a huge point, is to make a profit as a farmer. And if all of a sudden, misshapen and what is currently considered a second carrot comes in the market, and now the prices of the first drop, that we don't want to see that necessarily. We want to see that the bottom line is improved, not necessarily even just kept even, and definitely not declining. So this is something that farmers kept bringing up as, we need more research, we need to have more understanding of, are these actually new markets where we have a new product that we're putting out in some sense? Do we have more demand now? Or is this actually going to impact our bottom lines in complex ways? So just one Chittenden County farmer, again, just illustrating a point brought up by many, it'd be awesome to have some market for that stuff, but if you lower the price, it's a problem for the rest of your marketplace, because you're always struggling to try to raise your price a little, and letting them go backwards is a bad news. So that type of idea. So this recommendation really stems from this concern, which was emphasized. Facilitate open discussion and support research, tracking seconds prices and the effect of introducing more of these products into the market on growers' bottom lines, especially as hopefully a lot more of these markets are opening. A third issue area, consumer demand for perfect produce. This always comes up, right? It's ridiculous that we can't. This stuff is perfectly good. Why does it matter that I was trying to sell? One of the farmers talked about how they had an order for 20,000 pounds of cucumbers. They're perfectly good, tasted excellent. They had a slight yellow line under them, and they got sent back. And he had so like a total disaster. So that type of how much that's an issue, how much that needs to change. So there was disagreement among the farmers of, one, this is something we can move the needle on. It needs a public education campaign. And then a whole bunch of farmers who were saying, we shouldn't even touch this. We're not going to change this. It's going to be a lot of effort for nothing. So this Rutland County farmer was very optimistic. He or she has a joke at their farm with their customers is, do you want to eat like a farmer? This is their kind of personal brand campaign. And if you eat like a farmer, that means you eat something that's not perfect looking. So really just trying to make it part of the conversation. And this person's belief that, yes, we can try to change how people think about a tomato that they last week wouldn't have bought, now they would, right? So the recommendation, okay, let's go with the ones who think that there's a shot in this. Launch a public campaign around Vermont, educate consumers on the various ways wholesome produce can look and how to eat seconds. There's more room for that. So far up till now, we've been talking about how farmers have discussed a new market and then a public education campaign, which feeds into that market. But obviously a huge part of the current way that in Vermont and elsewhere that all of these seconds and things that could go to food loss is captured is through donations, right? And gleaning. And so the next couple ones have to go with that area. And so this first one, a lot of the farmers are talking about how they do donate a lot of produce, but that one area in which that could be improved that would actually incentivize them to donate more and therefore reduce the amount of food loss on the farm is to get some more transportation assistance. So as this Windham County farmer said, well, pickups are always huge for us because we don't generally deliver food otherwise. It tends to make or break our decision to do things, especially when there's not money involved. So anytime anybody can come get it from us, it makes a huge difference. There's like a number of farmers really emphasize this point. We're not making any money on this. We're happy to donate to a certain extent, but really this is what's really limiting us from donating even more and capturing more of that food loss. And especially if that's the metric that we're looking at, this would be kind of one lever to reduce that. And that's the recommendation. Next slide, please. Thank you. And another one was more storage at recipient sites. This actually came out with Salvation Farms. We did another report that's also available on Salvation Farms' website, which it was measuring the demand for fresh produce at recipient sites, donation to recipient sites around the state. And this was actually one of our recommendations, more storage. And this was something that interesting that came out from farmers when we didn't ask them about what they think donation sites needed or recipient sites needed. This came out through conversation. You know what? A number said more storage at sites would be really helpful. So this is an example to help illustrate what they mean. And so I said, if you have a place to store these, and they only need to be stored in like a 35-degree root cellar, they'll last a month. If you have a place to store them, I'll cut 150, 250, whatever you need, Brussels sprout stalks, like we ate today, and give them to you. If you can store them, you can have them. And they had no place to store them, so those ended up getting wasted. So these, like both the transportation and then the storage, are just both parts of, farmers are doing as much as they can in terms of coming to a certain point, and then these are the extra assistance pieces that could really help capture more loss. Invest in more storage. Yeah, recommendation. 2 more recommendations. With regards to gleaning, one of the issues, a lot of farmers in our interview sample work with gleaners, some regularly and some irregularly, so occasionally. A number of them found the gleaning operations extremely helpful. Big themes that came out from those both participating and even those not participating with gleaners was this idea of scheduling. So 2 different issues. The first one, the issue of, and this is so interesting that Lee was talking about this predictive, how much can we stretch the predictive, predicting harvesting times. There was such an emphasis of the Vermont farmers, particularly in this study, on how hard it is to predict even a few days ahead of time. that really this is being operated on such a very, very short timeline. So this is just one farmer, Windham County farmer. We have a number of different farmers, though, with the same exact sentiment. If we could call somebody up at 5 o'clock and say, I've got a bunch of stuff, and they could be here at 5 o'clock the next day, that would be like that's what makes it work well, because that's the nature of, that's how I manage. So I take a walk at the end of the day and I see what needs to be done, and the next day we do it. Not like 3 days down the road. And it's really hard to, I can understand how that's really challenging, but that's how things work in a vegetable field. This sentiment is just kind of like really emphasized. And then don't change this slide yet. But the next idea, though, which is kind of trying to work with this idea that a number of farmers are like, listen, this is pretty hard to get people on the phone. I imagine, okay, immobilize all these volunteers, and what's the expression, on a flip of a dime? That's not the expression, but now it is. What if we just set regular visits? And this is something that a lot of gleaning organizations already do with some of their farming participants. But this was definitely, so the next slide, this is definitely a theme. This Orange County farmer brings up this idea, just basically, I won't read this whole one. It would be so easy to find a bed of arugula that we're done harvesting, but that there's still plenty of good arugula out there. They wanted to come and harvest. I'll be able to do it. The sentiment that if gleaners came at a very regular interval, a number of farmers were like, I would just find something for them. It might not be a lot. It might not even be necessarily what the gleaning organization wants in that moment, but I could always find something, and then I don't have to communicate regularly. I don't have to plan for it. Another thing I can take off my calendar in some sense. So the recommendation that stems from this is really about this gleaning organizations, farms coordinating well ahead of season, because this is kind of the timeline of this, on whatever the mobilization response strategy is. And I'm sure these organizations already do this, but in some sense this did come up a lot in the interviews. So to consider that, either one in which gleaners do mobilize in a very short time frame, or one in which they come on a regular schedule. So the final one is interesting. It was surprising that farmers brought this up, and it was definitely a strong theme, that people were both critical of themselves, critical of others. It was just really fascinating, this idea of farming management and techniques and how much that affects how much food is being lost. So the next slide, just for an example, so this Washington County farmer, and these are all counties in Vermont, the reason that we have crops, we don't make the cut, it's not labor, it's a management thing. You have on something that didn't get weeded on, something that didn't get sprayed on time, or irrigation wasn't quite enough. But this idea of that kind of critical nature, again, self or at other farmers, was really interesting. That came out in this analysis. And so the recommendation, I think what's key here is that there's a lot more to learn, basically, because there were some specifics, but in general, we need to have a better conduct future research, and identifying which planting, growing, harvesting practices are the ones that are being really difficult to maintain. Again, not just at one or two farms, but kind of what are these things coming out, and that actually lead to substantive food loss, right? Where are kind of the real things to pull on. So with all of these recommendations, we're looking at, this is the stage where we're looking at feedback and really trying to get an understanding of where they're at. So I'd love to hear your recommendations and feedback on this. And that's the feedback slide. So thank you.
Well, and I'll also bring your attention to a small handout. In addition to the work we've done with Alana, we worked with a UVM undergraduate class. And based on the food loss study that we did in 2016, they tried to quantify some sunk resources, so in the way of water and fuel lost in the state of Vermont. The estimate was around 141 million gallons of water every year is lost in producing edible food that never leaves the farm, and roughly 8,000 gallons of fuel is lost on farms when edible food doesn't leave the farms. So I don't know as though it was fully defined. Maybe it was food loss versus food waste, and I think Lisa made a great point or question is, are we talking downstream or upstream? And I think that's a great way to frame food loss being on farm, being a lost food resource, but not really something in the waste stream. So it's really upstream. And it does have a different set of opportunities to respond to it than the food waste issue, which is something that's downstream. It's already in the waste stream. So I like that was pulled out. So Lisa and Lee, given your experience in national research and in-field research, and hearing Alana describe the research that's been done in Vermont so far, what would your recommendations be to the state of Vermont to better understand the realities in the state?
That's a good question. I mean, really, it's doing this data collection. So we like to say what gets measured gets managed. So I think that the solutions, especially at a state level, that you'll be looking into are going to have to be highly tailored per crop. Because as both of our studies, you saw like the reasons for loss, how much was lost, it's so different between each crop. So I think continuing to do measurement is really important. And when you can start to move into the phase of getting growers to measure on their own, that's what we're starting to work towards. Is we've been developing a measurement tool with SISC, which is the Stewardship Index for Specialty Crops, and they have a few different metrics like water usage, energy, and now food loss, so that growers can go in field, plug and chug some numbers, and it'll spit out how much loss is occurring. So I think once again, I can't say it enough, but the idea is that when the farmer is in there measuring themselves and seeing what that number is, that they'll right away figure out how to manage it. I think if they're the ones to see it and just bring it into like their day-to-day practices. So I really can't emphasize measurement being the most important thing that at the state level that could continue to be done, especially if this is some of the first work of it. I mean, there's still a lot more.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's something to track, just like the numbers y'all were talking about at lunchtime. This is how much Vermont food Vermonters are eating. I mean, I think it's important to take a look, at how much food is lost too. Just as a missed opportunity. In work in North Carolina, we try and focus on what opportunities are there for the grower, as well as what opportunities are there for maybe a social impact. Because they're not always important to the same people.
And you say you mentioned the monitoring is really important for the state. Is there a role that policy should be playing in Vermont to make this happen? Should the Agency of Agriculture be investing in the efforts to collect this data? Lisa, where has your funding come through to be able to do this? And if farmers are supposed to do it, how do they fit that? Like, how do we make it easy for them? Are they getting compensated? Does, again, the State Agency of Agriculture make an application, web-based application that they can easily track their data? Like, how do you make it a priority at the state level? And certainly offer your perspective.
I think, showing how much economic loss is happening for everyone because of this. So hopefully in itself will show, by collecting data, we can show state, government, like there's a huge economic opportunity. Fine if you don't care about food insecure, fine if you don't care about the environment, but we could be utilizing this product and multiple people along the supply chain could be making profit from it. And then your second point, you kind of had a second question in there that I had an answer to. But
I have very hard time.
I know, but you guys can go.
It's about how to make monitoring easier.
Okay.
Yes.
We're asking farmers because I think that point is right. If the farmers see what they're losing by keeping their own records, they may be inspired by exploring alternative markets for whether it's surplus that's first quality or surplus that's second quality. So how do we make it easy for them? Who incentivizes them?
I'm not sure, but I remember my other point, which does is related, which is that I forgot to mention that something that came across in our qualitative interviews by multiple growers was reference to when they were getting state or federal incentives to, it was the peach growers, to harvest their seconds peaches to be frozen for schools. And it was just like a couple of years ago that they stopped this program. And growers said, they're like, that was awesome. That was getting us to go back in the field. We were harvesting the seconds. We loved seeing how they were being used, but now with like farm bill negotiations, it's not going to come back either. But I mean, incentives.
That's great. We, Salvation Farms, one of our program or kind of opportunities that we're modeling is the idea of an in-state commodity system. And if we could have the state of Vermont subsidizing the diversion of what would be food loss into an alternate market that then would serve an institution that is buying cheap food from elsewhere, what would it do economically? What would it do for agriculture? So, like on that topic, supply chain. Really, what are the opportunities to build infrastructure for not necessarily a hyper-local, but a regional food system by using edible product that remains on farms?
I could tackle that one. I'm going to try. In North Carolina, we have a farm to food bank program, and it's been going for a couple of years, but it's not federally funded. And in some travels around the country, I've come across a few programs that are federally funded, and they use, or state funded in some cases, but those funds are often used by food banks to transport food or otherwise increase infrastructure. I've done some, and I'm not an economist, but I've done some back of the napkin calculations that show that some of these farm to food bank type programs could work well even for the grower, making it profitable for the grower if those programs are able to accept unsorted, unpacked produce, so such that comes in a huge field bin. So that's going to require some change to what they do, or maybe change to how they might sort produce in their facility. Now, we have a huge food bank in Raleigh, North Carolina, that serves 20 counties or 30 counties. I mean, it's huge, and they have tons of forklifts and all kinds of storage, but they still, in many cases, require products to be packed. And of course, at the pantry level, things are required to be packed for easy handling. But I think the more that they could take on some of that sorting, packing, washing portion, they could pay growers a little bit, and it might still be profitable for growers.
And that has also certainly been, I think, some opportunity here in Vermont as well. I know from some experience working within the food bank that they do have some capacity to receive large volumes and do some packing with volunteers, and that's a large part of our Vermont commodity program of really taking from the farmers large volumes of product, often unwashed and needing to be sorted to do just that, getting it prepared for market, whether it's charitable or institutional.
The packing and the sorting and the packaging costs themselves really are exponentially high and are difficult to get around for the grower.
Any other thoughts from the two of you thinking of supply chain development and thinking of this, also the theme, how could we move the dial on resilience and be proactive in building a resilient food system? Is this part of that?
Well, I think I'm going to jump in again. Losses on the farm are not always a result of what happens on the farm. Many, many times they're a result of what has happened in the supply chain itself and how demand fluctuates. So I think the more buyers are accepting of, a wider range of quality, which translates to the more consumers are accepting, we would see a lot of change there.
Yeah, in this discussion, it kind of brings up this thought. It's more of a question of, how much is this the role of the farmer, and how much is this the role of other people who work with farmers? It's a question.
Yeah, and I think so. Based on the breakouts that we had here this morning, I went to the production and processing one, and a lot of similar themes came up that we're looking at World Wildlife Fund, which is there's a lot of these hubs, so whether they're like distribution hubs or, I mean, that's usually what they are, is distribution hubs, but also having those be created or places where growers can go to create value-added items, so having them fully equipped, and then having more of them, having them be places where growers can go for business advice, if they're having issues marketing their product. So in terms of infrastructure, I mean, that was a very, I think we have to sometimes throw out those really big ideas first to then go back and figure out how we can maybe get there. But I am hopeful when I see these hubs, but like how can we evolve them to really meet all those needs and help growers with marketing their product, getting their seconds out there, value-added processing, making those centers more dynamic.
And that sounds as though it is reinforcing regional food system development and reliance.
Yeah.
You mentioned in your presentation, Lee, about frozen foods and figuring out how to. It's interesting. I didn't realize that they had lost market appeal, so to speak. And coming from the World Wildlife Fund, and I think of you as a ecologically based organization, is there any focus beyond frozen foods to canned or dehydrated foods that might be less energy intensive in the long run and create longer term resilience versus frozen foods, which are energy intensive and also are perishable?
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I don't know about, I don't know specifically about canned and dehydrated, and, I should have thrown that out there with the example of frozen, but we definitely have to be careful how we throw out around that term for that exact reason, because it requires a ton of energy to freeze items as well. So, before we go doing work in that area, we'd have to assess which is using more energy, freezing a product or still having food loss of fresh marketable product. I think that's a really tricky question to answer that I can't yet.
Still sit and listen in, or can we?
Oh, sure, absolutely.
I just would say that in my own work, I realized that it's let's talk about food storage, and then you can use whatever criteria that makes sense to people doing that work. So energy use and all of those kinds of considerations, it's easy to bring that into a discussion than if what we're talking about is storing food.
Then frozen is shelf stable, forever. So
there may be some applications where freezing is exactly right.
Right.
It just depends.
Right.
On the specific situation.
Right.
We talked to an organization that had started, I don't know if they started in our state, I think they did, Seal the Seasons, which is kind of rapidly growing around the country, and they're freezing fresh produce. Typically berries, I think. Have you seen those? Seal the Seasons? Anyway. And we talked to them about vegetables specifically, and they said that didn't pencil out for them right now because of the lower value product, and then they also require another step beforehand, like blanching. So they would have to, change up their facility. And we've investigated dehydration at NC State. We actually built a mobile dehydrator similar to, if y'all are familiar with the Pack and Cool trailer, which came out of NC State. Anyway, it was kind of modeled after that. Mobile dehydration trailer, which was really cool and works beautifully until you run up against every single food safety law in the world, because it becomes, when you want to, it's just what we were trying to do that was the problem. If you want to dry one thing at one facility, that's no problem. You do the testing and follow the regulations and requirements for that product in that facility. If you want to you want to take something on the road, you have now a facility, and if you want to dry different crops with it, then you have to do testing for pathogens on each and every one of those crops. So the testing itself just becomes outrageous. But dehydration is a great way to preserve food.
So again, I feel like crop specific, product specific. I know like seafood is flash frozen when it's harvested, and then it gets to retail, and we de-thaw it just to make it look pretty, which triples how quickly it's gonna start decomposing and rotting. If we could just kept it frozen for display, it would last. So.
You were just talking about seal the seasons, and I was curious if you know of any, and you started to talk about NRDC's, I think, Save the Food campaign. Mm-hmm. Are there any other consumer education campaigns that you know of that you would recommend? Or
theirs is the largest one I know. I'm sure I've seen a lot of small ones, but theirs is awesome. Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, theirs is the only one I know of.
The EPA has a lot of resources also if you want to do food waste audits in schools or restaurants or whatever. And there are toolkits for measuring in, retail environments or distribution. And one of the most, we touched on this a minute ago, but one of the most exciting innovations has been software for tracking and recording. So there's a lot of action really going on.
Is that software designed for downstream or upstream? Is it food loss or food waste focused?
It's food waste focused, yeah. I can think of two examples, LeanPath and Winnow. Yeah, but I mean, there's other software that's focusing on the agricultural level, which is more of like matchmaking type software. I have something I don't need and I want something. So I don't know how well that's working or how much it's taking off.
I'm just kind of curious, Lee, like with you guys studying this in the vein of like trying to, is it ultimately trying to decrease land that is being taken over for production? Are you guys also looking at the reasons why some farmland is being abandoned or not being, or like underutilized, or like farmland that is viable and not being? Do you think there's anything that's like underutilized that could be better used? Have you guys found that? I don't know if you've looked at that. I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, we have, so it's going to make it so complicated, but we have a food team, and then we're food waste, and we're in the like Markets Institute, and we actually run across all of our goal teams, which is like freshwater, oceans, food, and that's something our food team might be working on. But I feel like this is related, we are starting to look at like stranded assets, so facilities in the U.S. that have been facilities, so not land that have been abandoned, that could be turned into some of the things we've been talking about, some of these hubs, maybe indoor vertical production farming. So we are starting to map out stranded assets, and those might be on large plots of land. But no, that's a good thing. I should look into.
Ilana, did you find in any of the qualitative review of interviews where farmers put off or insulted by being engaged or approached about this topic?
The only thing was that a number pushed back on the term being used of food waste and food loss. Not all of them, but a substantive portion where they would say being tilled under, being given to for animal feed isn't waste and isn't loss. And so in the car this morning, Lisa was talking about different terms that you use. What are the terms that you use there? Unharvested or
unutilized.
And I think those terms might have communicated this, helped us figure out the exact same thing from farmers, putting us on the same page. That was the only thing. I mean, the ones who willingly participated and were incredible in sharing a lot of their time and knowledge. That was the kind of the only little bit of pushback of like, well, so we didn't use it for that, and nobody's presented an economic argument as to why it actually costs them, that it's really such an economic loss for them to keep it in the field or to give it to animals. I haven't seen that calculation, and they definitely didn't bring up anything or said that it's not that big of a loss, so economic loss. So what's the big deal anyways? And if it is, I think maybe if one were to find, yes, you're actually losing this much more money if you just used just your fertilizer and just the normal animal food you buy, you'd be saving this much money. That might be more of a way to say, to talk about that issue area too. So that was the only pushback.
Did either of you find farmers' response a strong response to this topic to be engaged?
They're more just, it's hard to get on field. It's hard to talk to them. So yeah, I mean, we're, on the different scale talking to some of like the largest producers in our country, and like, they don't want to give you any time, but I felt like we got our foot in the door with some really great growers who are a bit more open-minded, and but some of the responses were so interesting. In the beginning, once you get before you get them warmed up, it'd be like, why are you talking to me? Like, talk to the consumers. Like, I'm only growing what they want. Or like, talk to my buyer. Like, they right away were like, this is not, you were talking to the wrong person. So that was really interesting.
Yeah, we talked a lot about efficiency of use. So we talked about an efficient use of their land, an efficient use of chemical resources. In particular, I did not really work with organic growers. Some did have a portion in organic production, but we talked about efficient use of chemical resources and efficient use of land. If growers wanted to try and produce more, they felt their first option would be to acquire more land, when in reality they could just chase down what they're actually producing. And so giving them these numbers back really informs them as to what more about their own crop they could know if they were measuring. So that's an important step. But talking about efficiency really kind of brings it home for growers.
Can you talk a little bit about? Oh, sorry. About just how a farmer would go about measuring their crops? I just don't know the process.
Yeah.
I'll go for it. First of all, I put out 2 videos and an extension bulletin on how to do it. You're basically just taking a sample of the field area, harvesting everything that's there, and then calculating up to the field. So for example, like a 10-acre field, I like to measure at least 0.1% of the field area. So it would be the equivalent of 3 randomly placed 50-foot rows, for example. Harvest everything that's there and sort it into those 3 categories: what's marketable, what's not marketable but still good, and then what's inedible. And then weigh those, record that, and then calculate up from there. It's very simple, very straightforward. And it doesn't matter what size field or farm you have or what crop it is. You can still do it that way.
And then, so we're in the pilot phase right now of the food loss calculator with CISC that I mentioned, and we put in there for measuring in-field loss using Lisa's protocol. So, we don't want to be turning the wheel again. She's already developed it, and it's awesome, and it works. And then, we have it for the whole, the full operation for a grower. So if they have their own processing facility on their farm and their own storage facility, we even bring in those components for measuring, and those are just much easier. It's just literally how much is coming into the processing facility, how much is leaving, how much is going into storage, how much is leaving. The most difficult number to get is that in-field loss.
Even that's easy.
But yes, but it is. But measuring is much easier. So
talking your way into the field is the hardest part. Yeah.
Just one observation. I'm so excited at all of you doing research from a food system lens, but including the producer, because that is rare in my experience. And I know it's difficult, and thank you for making that effort, because that's how we get to solutions. It's not consumers sitting around with environmentalists and talking about what farmers should do, right? And it's not talking to farmers on their own because they're in this market. You've all made that point. The market is determining their behavior to a large extent. So I think it's a great model for Vermont Food Network to take up as you begin really looking into waste, is making sure you're talking to farmers. And I would just ask everyone to think about how much richer this conversation was because we had the farmer information. And then the last thing to say is just when you say it's hard sometimes to get to farmers, I would say part of that, I would bet it would be a lot easier if you went in collaboration with someone or some group that they felt were allies.
Yeah, absolutely.
World Wildlife Fund, for most farmers, I'm guessing they were very skeptical.
Yeah,
of
which
what
is
we were
what.
all
Yeah,
about.
yeah. So I mean, our research groups didn't say they were with us. It was UC Davis coming in as UC Davis.
Yeah, but even UC Davis.
Well, yes.
Yeah, but just you hear my point.
Totally, yeah.
So don't take away from this. Farmers are not interested because there are a lot of reasons out there for there being concern on their part that someone's coming in to look at waste, which can be considered a criticism and has been used to criticize farmers by folks that are not farmers and don't understand. So I really appreciate that work.
Yeah, I want to make a point too. That's a really good point, and that's one thing that I wanted to know back in 2010 when I started reading about food waste is what's happening on farms and why don't we have this information. So Teresa asked a minute ago, where did I get funding to do my work from? And the initial funding that I got was from USDA SARE, the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Foundation. I don't know if foundation's on there, but anyway. I work at North Carolina State University for the Center for Environmental Farming Systems, which is the Sustainable Ag Research arm of NC State. It's in partnership with NCA&T State University and North Carolina Department of Ag. But the issue that we're studying here in food loss is very much sustainable agriculture, which it didn't even occur to me right away. But as growers produce more efficiently, they're conserving land resources, but there's also that social aspect. They can be saving money or earning more money. So all three legs of the stool are there. However, it's not maybe uppermost in growers' mind, the growers that I've been working with, to tackle these things. So in order to both amplify the message that the scale of food loss is huge, but at the same time gather up that data, it's been imperative to engage the grower in a partnership. And to do that, I have wanted to grab onto large growers where moving the needle could, in essence, move the needle in our food system. We have a lot of smaller growers in North Carolina and a lot of sustainable growers who would I self-identify as sustainable growers. But those people are already doing many things that are beneficial both to the environment and society. So I wanted to target larger growers without targeting them, but by holding their hand and saying, you're not doing anything wrong. But these numbers are surprising for a lot of people. And here's, if you took a hard look at them, what would you do differently? And so we had some of those conversations, but many, many things were left out, including, mostly the word sustainable, because it's just not an area that they feel they want to chase down. But I'm also a member of the Department of Horticultural Science, which is a very well-respected unit in my university, so I can claim that at any time and have that.
Yeah, be flexible and show different faces.
Yeah, absolutely.
For sure.
Just to also respond to your point, so I work across a number of different fields and contexts, not agricultural fields, and pun intended, but that. To be honest, I've never had such high response rates, and we've done 3 studies together. And I'm not trying to embarrass you, but the idea is that the groundwork you've done, the relationships that Teresa and Salvation Farms has built over the course of many years, is why we've been able to do this research. That if I had gone in by myself or potentially affiliated with something else, it might not have. I can assure you it wouldn't have been as high response rates and therefore and participation. And I can't this point, the emphasis of the community relations as not only is the backbone to practice and policy, it's also the backbone to research that needs to be done at the community level.
It's also the backbone to resilience.
The backbone to resilience. There you go.
And just one more point, and then I'll be quiet. The other thing I'm noticing in this session is that you're talking about monitoring, and that's the umbrella that's monitoring's in is adaptive management, which came up in some of the materials that we developed for the brainstorm, but I didn't really talk about it today in the presentation. But I just want to point out how powerful, I don't know about y'all, but I sat here and looked at the waste that you measured, that was measured in all 3 of your studies, and wow, you know? And what that made me think of is how important this kind of measurement is in order for us to get a handle on what the problems are and what solutions are, and how rarely it is done for so many of the issues that we care the most about. So that's another, I think, exemplary part of what y'all are all doing, is that you're getting out there and doing the hard measurements, the ones that aren't done either because they're not convenient or because they're difficult to do. So really important to see the value in that as well. We need to be measuring the stuff that we care about. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I want to be mindful of our time. We've about 10 minutes left, and you are a small and mighty group to sit through this. I think it's been really rich, and again, I want to thank the 3 of you. And on this topic of really like having the farmer be central, I want to ask one last question to the 3 of you. You know, how can a regional food system meet the needs and interests of farmers as it relates to reducing food loss on farms? And really, what do the farmers want? We had a little discussion over lunch of they've lost their extension service. They used to serve them a half a century ago in every county. What would be the resource to farmers, or how do we approach this regionally with them in mind?
I feel like I'm kind of already talked about, you know, my takeaways from this work and just from what I've heard today. But it's still just bringing those opportunities to farmers. So whether it's, you know, value-added processing or understanding of their own loss and waste in field, so helping them measure, to like the creation of these hubs, and what you're saying. Yeah, but mostly it was you that made the point of, you know, extension services are kind of disappearing, or what they used to do isn't what they're doing anymore. And, you know, as Laura said, like how important it is to talk to farmers. There's some here today, and that's who, like, you know, I was talking to 2 of them this morning, and they're the ones who were like, I wish I had somewhere to go and somebody to talk to about the different opportunities in Vermont. Like, I feel a little bit lost. And these are guys who have been farming here their whole lives, and they're here today, you know, looking for answers. So I think that says a lot. But
you work more regionally. Well, I do too. I mean, I would say don't forget about large growers in, you know, regional planning. I mean, we have a food policy council in North Carolina. I mean, in Wake County, where I live, and the leader of the Food Policy Council really earnestly wants Raleigh, North Carolina, and Durham to be fed by Wake County and growers there. However, the population is such that, you know, we're fed by, you know, Wake County and California and Chile and Australia. So, you know, I would encourage, you know, even in regional planning, to recognize that there are maybe large producers that would like the opportunity to participate and benefit from those programs as well. They're also local in many cases, depending on where you are.
I think what I've learned through the research is very much kind of echoing Lee's main takeaway. I feel like we should have a bunch of MBAs in the room, or some people who do business stuff. It seems like if there's more opportunity, and this is a simplistic understanding of it from my point of view, that the value-added processes are such a value. The farmers they are such a value when they have that opportunity, when they have the misshapen carrots, they sell it to the juicers. They said that it's the easiest thing in the world, the ones who talked about that, who are able to do that. But I'm only able to do it for carrots. What about my other crops? And especially in Vermont, where people really grow a lot of different, a large variety. And the relationships with restaurants, with schools, you know, the farm to school presented there during lunch. The prisons, the other institutions around Vermont, how valuable selling to institutions who are able to process and cook the foods, how easy that is in some sense, taking away the standards and the grades and all of that, because it's good food and you can work with it. It's not going to cost you that much more in labor to cut it up in a certain way. And I think that the emphasis of that, the farmer's emphasis on those two, for the ones who are using that and wanting more, and the ones who didn't have it but wanted seconds markets, where do those pop up? How can those be incentivized and supported? And that's why we need in some sense, the business people in the room, because I don't have that answer.
And one other point I guess I'd like to make is that this really is a systems approach and understanding the capacity of all the stakeholders involved. Because, when we're talking about food loss and waste, even if you get the food, the excess out of the field, but then there's not the capacity of the food bank. Like the food bank doesn't want to be the ones to put it in the landfill. So we need to understand everyone involved in the system and their capacity, for this issue that we're discussing. And also, with constant measurement, we notice that loss is occurring at low frequency but high volume, and that's because of climate change. So measurement, can it ever stop? Because climate change is constantly changing in its form. So that's just something else to put on the radar.
So two really significant points. Yeah. I think that's where it's going to be hard to be predictive as well as have research feel complete, because one season is not like another, and especially in the era of extreme climate change. And the farmers that we've worked with for 10 years, and they've seen it drastically change from 30 years ago when they started to 15 years ago, and they don't know what a normal season is anymore. Yeah. And I do think that we need to look at the supply chain as well and the bottlenecks. We work with charitable food outlets in Vermont, including the Vermont Food Bank, and also regionally, places in Boston, places in New Hampshire, because sometimes we can't move the food in Vermont. And we're not even barely handling that much volume. So it's really looking at the supply chain infrastructures for multiple outlets and where those bottlenecks and hurdles are. So, thank you again for traveling to Vermont to be with us today. I think this is a critical topic, and I really appreciate your investment in time and energy to come here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.